My name is Lee June, and I'm to lead this particular session. I have kind of two titles. I have Men's Leadership and Men in Leadership. And we only have an hour, and I obviously have more materials than we have time for, but I'll kind of tell you what I have and I'll give you a sense of where we're going, but I'm open to changing some things and maybe emphasizing some things more from one point of view than another in order that we meet the needs of those who are in the audience. And if we had time, we would even go around and kind of introduce yourself, but I guess I'll forestall that. That would be typically what I would do to get a sense of who the people in the room. I do not come as an expert in this area. I see people in the audience who could do a better job at this than I can, but what I'll do is try to facilitate a discussion around the topic. What I'm going to do is just, some of this I might skip, some general comments on leadership. We all know the next one, what is leadership, some nuggets on leadership. One of the things that you can pass the handout. I have a handout with all the materials that's going to be on the screen except for a couple of things that I added last night or early this particular morning. So you'll have all of that, and we don't have to cover it, and we probably won't. But the idea of some nuggets on leadership, one of the things that as I was preparing this, it dawned on me, I could go to the literature and pull out a lot of material. But if you think of the summit and what we've done over these many years, materials have really come out of this organization that we can really focus on. I mean, I could go out and get people like Maxwell and all these others who are so-called gurus on leadership. But we have written and made available through the years a variety of materials that we can utilize, and I'm going to draw from that rather than going to some of the other literature, except in one case. For instance, I don't have it with me, but we have Dr. Richardson here, who has written extensively in this area in terms of men leadership, done workshops. He has a book called The Urban Family, and he's written several in others, and just to deal with maybe the references. We did in 1991 a book called The Black Family. We can draw from that, and there are people in the audience who wrote on that and dealt with leadership. Then in 1996, we came out with a companion volume. One was called Men to Men, and I'm going to reference to that I edited, and then Norvella Carter out of Texas did a companion volume called Women to Women. And in those books are quite a few principles on leadership, so written by us, to us, et cetera, so I'm going to draw on those. Then in 99, we did another book called Evangelism and Discipleship in African American Churches. That has a lot on leadership. And then Matt Parker and Eugene Seals back in 95 did a book on Call to Lead. And there are leadership principles in all of those. And then in 2013, I did a co-edited a book called African American Church Leadership, Principles for Effective Ministry and Community Leadership. And there are several people who have written to that particular topic. So we go on. And then I have one, because one of the elephants in the room is often when you talk about men leadership, the issue comes up about women leadership. And I was just telling my wife, it might have been great, maybe we can do that the next time, is to have a combined session where the men and the women talk together. Because there are some elephants in the room, and I'm going to quote a few things from this particular book. Actually, Stan Guntry and James Beck were the general editors for this book, and it's called Women in Ministry, Two Views on Women in Ministry. So that's some of the things we can talk about. But since we are we're all men, I want you to raise your hand and raise questions if you want to talk about. So I was going to do some nuggets from those books, a biblical perspective, We'll get into leadership, a gendered perspective, two views of women in leadership. And the reason I put that up is that, as men, our views of leadership is also influenced by our views of how we view women in ministry. And that's still a hot topic in some areas. So we'll talk briefly about that. And then along with that are some of the controversial passages on leadership that we often deal with, some specific biblical commands to men. We probably won't deal with that, but qualifications of effective biblical leaders, some of the biblical expectation of men in the family as leaders. And interesting enough, one of my views is you could take the book of Proverbs and really go through the Proverbs and do a lot of principles in terms of leadership. So you have all of that in your handout. We'll talk about that because I think that's very important. And then I would be curious if we have time, who are some of your views of men in the Bible who you consider exemplary leaders? I have my list, and then we'll talk about mistakes men often make. Now, just to give you some background of who I am, I've been around for a long time. I'm getting up there in age, It's amazing. Sometimes I have to ask myself, am I as old as I am? But anyway, that's not. But I basically spent most of my time in, and I put it in quotation, in secular leadership roles at Michigan State University. And one of my earliest struggles was the whole question of, the secular versus, people had this idea, if to do ministry, you have to do it in churches or whatever. And I had to come to grips with that. And I finally come to grips with that God had called me and placed me at Michigan State University, and that was my ministry. And as I begin to really resolve that question, I feel that I've become more effective. So I'm just quickly tell you some of the roles that I've held over the years. And I started off as an assistant director in the counseling center. Then I became an associate director. Then in 1980, I became an acting assistant provost for special programs. Then came back later after I did a sabbatical and became director of the counseling center, did that for about 9 years. And then in 1989, the students at Michigan State took over the administration building. And relationship between administration and students had really broken down. And so they came to me and asked me to be a senior advisor to the provost for racial, ethnic, and multicultural issues. The goal there was to try to reestablish relationship between the university and students. That was a very interesting time and a lot of things that I learned about. But my goal was to make sure the students, as you know, on campuses, what they do is they do demands. And they use the word demand deliberately, and they expect the institution to do certain kinds of things. And so they may have 36 demands. And so one of my tasks was to make sure that the university lived up to the agreement that they made. And so I had to do interaction between the two. This is being taped, so I won't make my other comment about Michigan State, but that was back then. Well, I'll say this, and I think one of the things that happened at Michigan State, if you've observed it in terms of the presidential transition and all of those things, is that really communication between students and administration really broke down again. And really there was no way, I won't say no way, they didn't repair it. And you could have predicted that they were going to eventually call for the president to resign. I won't go further with that. Then I became, after that 3-year stint, an associate provost for academic student services and multicultural issues. And then later, 3 years later, they asked me to be vice president for student affairs and services. And one of the things I did was say, okay, well, that's another whole discussion, but we merged those two roles because my view was that if you were going to be an effective vice president, you also needed to have connections with the academic side. So I became vice president and associate provost so that I dealt with both the president and the provost. The provost of an institution, is really the power position. That's where 75% of the budget And then I also was president of the Black faculty. That was an interesting experience. President of the Michigan Association of Black Psychologists. And then, I've had a lot of church-related roles. I won't go into that. Deacon, trustee, Sunday school superintendent, et cetera, et cetera. And then I did this last night. It's not in your handout because we're talking about men leadership. And this is something that I'm going to probably develop. This is what I call my 6 P's of my leadership over the years. This is how I, even in a secular environment, prayer. And as we go through it, we know the essential component of praying. And even at Michigan State University, prayer was central. You have an office that's private, and even you in that kind of institution, all you have to do is shut your door and get on your knees. And, so what I did was undergirded by prayer. There are people around the country and also the institution who was praying for me. Then you need a plan. Obviously, people talk about strategic planning. I have this particular view, I know it's true, is that if you're in a predominantly white environment and they bring you in administrative positions, they usually have an agenda for you. There's certain things they want you to do. So going in, I was at least wise enough to know that. And so the question becomes, what is their agenda? When I became vice president, it's just not that they just picked up anybody who was a vice president. They had a reason. That was, with issues with students, so they wanted me to do certain kinds of things. And so I had to go in and say, okay, now what is my agenda? And then, you don't always make that public. I can say some things now that I'm not in administration. You have your private agenda, and you have to work your agenda. So you have to have a plan, patience. I'm a very patient individual. I don't give up easy. You put something on the table, it's rebuffed, then you go away, work it again, come back, and eventually get some things done. Persistence, and then also some principles. And if I had time, we could spend the whole session on those things. I, in my own mind, made up my mind that there were certain things I would not do. And I had a line drawn that I would not cross. Now, the other thing, my wife is sitting in the back, the other thing we did, and I'm just being led by the Spirit, I'm going a little different from where I thought I was going. But when you move up, you saw the position, you move from assistant director to associate provost to vice president. Each of those steps, you get more what? Money. And so one of the things my wife and I decided to do early was that as we move up and get more money, we would not change our lifestyle. And the idea there was that I wanted to be able to lead with integrity. And if they asked me to do some things that I think violated some of my principles, then I was willing to walk. And so I didn't go out and get a new car. We stayed in our house for most of that time. We ended up doing the reverse of what many people did. We upgraded on the last end rather than on the front end. But anyway, that was strategic. And then you have the purpose. And then I won't go there. If you have some questions about any of this, I want to make it something that's helpful to you. We're men, and you want to talk about it, raise your hand, jump in, and I'll talk. But feel free to jump in, but if you don't talk, I'm going to talk. Okay. And then some additional points, personal points on leadership that I just want to throw out is also I learned, and I think this is true, good for men, and maybe some of you disagree. If you disagree with me, also let's jump in. Number one, you are not your position. That's something I learned early, and when I talk to young people in leadership, one of the things I notice sometimes is you go around the room and people introduce themselves, and let's say, okay, and they'll say, I am vice president for whatever. And one of the things the Lord told me early in the game is don't do it that way. I tried to say, my name is Lee June, and I serve as whatever. And that's very important, at least for me, because what it did for me is to realize that I was in a position, but I was not the position. And a lot of people get into that and they think they are the position. And then when they leave or you get fired or whatever the case might be, you have a lot of issues around readjusting. Matt talked about that, collard greens and those other kinds. I could get into that. I'm really not into what I was supposed to be saying, but I'm keep talking. Okay, but anyway, you have to make sure you don't isolate yourself from your people. And particularly in these kinds of environments, that can happen. And then the other one is to act while you have a chance. Things come up that you want to do, and you need to do them after prayer when you have the opportunity. Don't put it off because you could be gone the next day. And then, so one of the things I tried to say is I want to leave this position with very few regrets. And then the last one is, and this is something I've seen, I think it happens in all settings, is you can stay too long. And so that's why to everything, there is a season. And so I had to figure out what was my season while I was in administration. Just a quick example is when I became director of the Counseling Center was started in like 1946, and all 4 directors were around. Well, 3 of the 4 directors. And in my first month, I had an interview with each of them and just got a sense of what was the challenges during their administration, because I have this also theory is that organizations are almost like people. They go through developmental stages. And one way of helping to frame where you need to go is to know where things have been. And so to everything there's a season, know when to hold it, know when to fold it, and know where to walk away. And sometimes our egos as men or just people in general sometimes don't allow us to do that. So if you have any questions about, we don't have to go through this, it's on your slide. We all agree that there's some universal principles around leadership. And the leadership principle, one must fail. If one who fails to plan, plans to fail. But there are some unique principles from the biblical standpoint that we need to do that. Now, I won't get into that because that's kind of elementary. We all know what leadership is. There's a lot of material on that. Hopefully you have your own definition of leadership. And one of the things I did put on the board, in the book Called to Lead, Matthew Parker had this particular comment that I thought we would put up. He said, the best leaders accomplish goals without making people feel they have been led. I think that's pretty profound. The best leaders accomplish goals without making people feel who they have been led. This can get into your ego. And let me just give an example of the way I kind of used that principle when I was, vice president and associate provost, is that, I would try to empower my directors. And even though there were some things I wanted to achieve, if I saw someone in the group really moving in that particular direction, I would give them ownership to that particular principle and then really feel good. It doesn't happen as long as the organization was moving and the goals were being directed. I didn't have to feel the need to get credit. And that's one of the mistakes men sometimes make that we're going to talk about in a minute. If you want to play around with definition, one of the things we did in the book, African American Church Leadership, is Matt and Chris Mathis and I, we did this chapter. And we got a bunch of people, probably 30 or more people around the country, young people, seasoned people, went to the literature and kind of just compiled all of their definitions of leadership. And it's kind of interesting just to see how young people, how they would define leadership versus young adults versus men versus women, et cetera, et cetera. So you can do that if you want to. This is the biblical definition of lead. Leader, one who commands, one who moves a person, a guide, or a teacher. So they're biblical definitions. And I want to quickly go through some nuggets on leadership. And this comes from Call to Lead. It's a 1995 book, and again, for those who might have come in late, I decided to just pull from the stuff we have written primarily. And it's powerful, some of the things that are in the books that is in your reference list. And I'm just going to pull out a couple things there. One chapter in that book, men, women, whoever, is that there has to be character, reputation. You know, Hank talked about last night a good name. That's probably, is better, et cetera, et cetera. So no character, right? There's another one from John Perkins. He pulled from the book of Esther, and he talks about Esther and how she operated as a leader. This is a woman, but she made some principles there. And if you kind of read through it, you can see how important that is. And then we don't have to talk about that, the view difference between bosses and leaders. You don't want to be a boss, that's old school. Strategic planning, obviously. This is very critical, and every time I come to the summit, Matt, how is he doing, Jeter? Joseph Jeter, is he? Jeter. He's doing pretty good. Yeah, he used to come. Anyway, so he wrote a chapter on prayer. And we know as men or people, period, one of the essential characteristics of effective leader is undergirding themselves in prayer. So he wrote the chapter. I'm just going through sound management. We know all of those. Beverly Yates, working yourself out of a job, building a team, all of these kinds of things. You can see the names, Russ Knight. Another one, and this is the one that we're going to talk about, some leaders are born women. So it's a very interesting chapter. And this is from the book that we did in 2013. Hank Allen, who was here last night, he wrote a chapter in that book on African-American churches, and then I just mentioned the chapter there. And then we have some how-tos of leadership. Paul Cannon, he's somewhere here. He wrote 3 chapters in that book. So if you want to draw on some resources, you can pull from there. And then you have several chapters. These are all written by women, and one of the things we're focusing on here is that effective leadership for men, women, period, is how do you handle the pressures of leadership. So there are 4 chapters dealing with that. How do you balance your mind, your ministry, your stress management practices, and I'll tell you mine. For instance, when things would get rough for me, one of the things I did, I have a very supportive wife. That was one. The other thing is I had people, some men particular, who I could go to their office. And there was this guy, I'm going to mention his name. His name was Tom Gunnings. He died a few years ago. But he was a very good political strategist. He was a psychologist too. And one of the things I had to do is there were times that I could go to his office and I said, look, I don't want you to say nothing. I just need to talk. And so I just get out all of my feelings and get the things out. So later, I don't go up in a meeting and blow up. But anyway, I couldn't afford Mike Lowes. See, he was too expensive. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, so the idea really here is that, men in terms of leadership, sometimes what you need, and I'm sure you have it, just people that you just really talk to deal with your stress, and then watch out for the long range of mentality. And then there's some other things, and my wife is in the back. She and her colleague wrote on concentrated women, freedom to lead by faith, dealing with some of the issues, particularly women face vis-a-vis men in terms of exercising their leadership ability. And then we'll talk about, the way the movement now is, the primary, when people talk about leadership, they talk now about servant leadership, and they also talk about transactional leadership. And there's some things there that we need to talk about. Now here's I'll call it the elephant in the room, things that we need to talk about. Although this session is men in leadership, the topic implies that one can look at leadership in reference to gender. So you have the men here, you have the women here. I don't know what they're talking about, but and there's some empirical evidence that when men and women often display differences in leadership style. My wife decided to re-enroll in a doctoral program. So she's writing this literature review on women leaders, and she's interested in possibly doing her work on the role of religion and faith in the leadership development of African American women. And so I've been reading some of the stuff she's been reading about the differences between men and women. And when you find these differences, or just in a general sense, we're not talking theological, we'll get into that in a minute, these differences are not biologically, but they are based on psychological and perceptual factors. So in the secular world, when you do these studies, you see how women are rated versus men, and then it really is influenced by how one's perception of women in general in terms of how they do those ratings. So those are some things there. Now, this is a book in one of our classes in seminary, and those who've been Bible school seminaries, you get into these discussions. And this is, to me, is an interesting book because I think it captures the controversy out there in terms of men and women. And so you really have two perspectives. And I wouldn't, if you want to talk about it, we can, and the label in the literature generally is that one is called the egalitarian perspective, the other one is called the complementarian perspective, the complementarian or traditionalist. And those are two prevailing views still out there. And what I would just encourage you to do is to think on what your position is. We're not going to debate it, but it does influence how you move and also how you operate in this environment. The egalitarian perspective really is simply, people believe that there's equal gifting for men and women. There's no distinction. Women can do every position in the body of Christ. That's the view. So if you want to read how they frame it, you can look at there. Then in that book, you have somebody who would argue against that. And so they'll go through scriptures, showing some things, et cetera, et cetera. And then those kinds of things. The complementarian position basically is that, women are equal in God's sight, but there are some roles that are only limited to men. And then even those who take either position, the one that they really struggle with, well, I'll show you that, and I'll mention it now, is whether or not women can be pastors, and they look at the whole thing of priests. All priests were men. And so people argue both ways. But I'll show you some of the controversial scriptures in a minute. They raise 4 questions, and I'm going to kind of go through them kind of quickly in terms of that. Does the Bible teach a hierarchical structure? Do we find women in the leadership in all positions? Do women in the Bible assume the same leadership roles as men? Does the Bible limit women from fulfilling certain roles? These are the arguments. And then it's kind of interesting, even though this is a book in seminary, in some of the publications we've done here also have touched on those issues. For instance, in the Novella Carter book in 1996 on Women to Women, there's a chapter written there. My wife did one back in that same book. And then there's one even in the 2013, really dealing with that question. So what I'll say to men in leadership, think through your position. We all will have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account for whatever our views are. But those are out there. And what you believe will affect how you operate. Now, these are the Genesis one, that they argue about, I will make a helper suitable for him. And they argue what that really means. The qualifications in Timothy, the husband of one wife, talking about the qualifications for a bishop. And, that's an argument. If people want to talk about it, we can, but I'm just laying it out. Keep silence in the church. So if you read one view and they each argue what it means and try to give their view. Not to teach or usurp authority. And this one, the Ephesian passages, submission or head. It's in there, maybe I'll do it now. For men, well, maybe I'll try to get you to talk. Anyone want to talk about that passage and how you feel as men we should deal with it? And what are some of the nuggets there that you want to come? Is that mic on? Okay.
I'd just like to say that
if you don't mind, you want to say who you are, if you don't mind being on the tape.
Case, president of African Americans for Missions, and I pretty much network the African American and Caribbean American brethren assemblies in the United States. We have about 144 African American or Caribbean American. I kind of network that. And because of my background with the Plymouth Brethren, my wife grew up in it. But at some point, I got exposed to this in the global, and became more than just a Plymouth Brethren, so to speak. And I had some tough decisions to make because as a man,
right.
and the role of the woman, and, our tradition is that they stay silent in the church and everything. But through a set of circumstances, we ended up at a Baptist church during our journey. And after it was time for me to go back to the traditional church, I had to make a huge decision. And I chose to leave my wife with the Baptists and got ostracized for it amongst the brethren. And they tried to put me out and all that stuff. But my decision was very simple. My wife had gifts. And in our context, those gifts really could not be maximized and utilized. And so by leaving her there and she being under me, her gifts were so utilized that she became the president of the women's movement. And this was a very large church. She was able to introduce Priscilla Sherrard and fill theaters of women.
Mm-hmm.
And she passed a month ago,
right.
But for the latter part of our marriage and her life, I was the one shoring her up.
Right. Okay.
To be used in the kingdom.
Right. Okay.
Myself been used globally.
Right.
Right. So she supported me.
Right.
But I'm so proud and happy.
Right.
That I allowed those gifts to flourish.
Right. Okay.
And she impacted women all over.
Thank you. Okay. So if you make comments, let's try to do it within 2-3 minutes at the most, and we want to make the session valuable to you.
Right. My name is Odell Cleveland, and I serve as, what you said, Chief Administrative Officer of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Greensboro, a very, very large African American church. A couple of points. I think the women's situation is somewhat based on your background before you got saved. Met a young lady, fell in love, got married. The pastor was female. That didn't really matter to me. I found out about all that later on in seminary and other things about can a female pastor marry me, but that's a whole other thing. What I'm going to talk about is the leadership, what we do a lot of. From the perspective of the budgeting aspects of it, what I find when I go to different churches around the country and help is that the financial aspects of it kind of falls back, the back room, because a lot of times as leaders, and I'm not gonna say ego, I would say sometimes the pastors put on a pedestal, and many think that the pastor should know everything about everything. And sometimes the pastor don't allow him or herself to seek the help and say, I don't know about this, and you end up messing things up. And then you call people like me in later on when the house is on fire. So that's the part with leadership from Financial Peace. And I hate too much, I'll be careful. The other part is the counseling. You know better. It's the difference between Christian counseling and counseling. Everything you can't do unless you've been trained to do. So you have to understand there's a certain point, then you stop. We're not asking Sigmund Freud and Jesus to get into an arm wrestling contest. That's not what you do. But you have to build those relationships so that if this is mental, if this is more than you equipped to deal with, because something is more than just pray about it, then you find, if you choose to, a Christian therapist who can go that way, get things straight, and then return the person back to you. And the last thing, and this is what we spend a lot of time, threatened of leadership. The leader being threatened of leadership. Now, there's a difference between the leader, because you're the pastor, you have the title, that's you, that's fine, but strong leadership around you can help you. They're not there to undo you, to overthrow you or anything, because that's why we miss it a lot of times. Because it takes a certain leader to lead leaders. And that's what I see, and that's what you come back and fix a lot of that stuff. And sometimes the pastor, the leader, has stayed there too long, not in a position, but stayed at a position, meaning that, no, we're not going to do this just because I say so. And then when the leader comes and brings evidence, and then you go with, well, I'm the pastor, well, I say so. And then that's how the church starts splintering. And it messes up a lot of people. Because when the church falls apart, a lot of people turn away from God.
Now, let me thanks for both of you coming. Let me make a further about staying too long. Here's my view, is that it does, sometimes you can stay 40, 50, 60, whatever the number, but if you stay that long, then you need to understand the changing dynamics over time. And that's what happens. For me, I spent 35 years in administration. I was vice president for 16 years. And what was happening is that when I went in, I had certain goals and, feel they were affirmed by the Lord that was to be accomplished. And I felt that most of them were being accomplished. And then I saw the university begin to change. They were moving in a direction that I was beginning to have some problems with. And they were moving in a direction that I felt that some of the issues that were going to need to be worked out was going to take about 45 years to really pull together. And I knew at that point that I wasn't going to be in that long. And so it was really time for me to exit. And then, I kind of got into the whole position of succession planning. And I'll say this, this is a predominantly white university. And one of the things, I was a black vice president, and one of the things the university wanted to diversify, and one of the things they would really push on African American in leadership, rather than trying to bring other people up, particularly African American, they want you to diversify in other areas. And so I made sure, we had Hispanic, and other kinds of things, et cetera. So I had two vice presidents. One was African American woman, and the other one was a Latino, a male. And so at least I tried to put people in positions that after I leave, we could maintain that particular diversity. But, I left at that point because I felt really that my time was up. And then I needed to pass the baton. And really And then the other thing I'll quickly say, the other thing I've seen in some cases, people get so attached to the perks and to the salary, and then they begin to be ineffective. And then what happens, if you look at it carefully, is their organization begin to decline, because they're really no longer at the top of the game. But the Ephesian passage, just going back to it quickly, and I'm sure you have theologians in the room. If you look carefully at it, the idea in there is that the first submission is to each other and also unto God. And then the word submission there really means to place oneself under the voluntary authority of another. And then if you go through the rest of the passage there, it talks about, particularly for the male, the emphasis is on you love your wife. You love. And so the idea really, early in the game, it doesn't happen anymore, but some men would use that as something to dominate. But that's really not, as we all know in the room, it's really not about domination. It's about the woman, and what the woman is told to make sure you respect. And the man is told to love, I think, 3 or 4 times in that particular passage. If you think about men in the family, Pastor Richardson and others have written about this, men we generally viewed as the priest, the protector, right? Provider. And that's one that we have to also deal, particularly with the younger people now, about the provider role and how that whole thing works out, because the landscape has changed. Women are getting married much later. Kelly is in the back. No, I'm going to pick on her. No, she's not married. But anyway, these time women, they've already accumulated their wealth. And so, it's possible that the woman might make more than the man, those kinds of things. My wife and I, we've been married 49 years. But what we did was we kind of grew up together. And so everything we got really is kind of a joint kind of effort. But so we have to think about how, even in your counseling, you talk about that provider role. We've already talked about the head, and, well, I won't get into that, but it's really how, we won't, the theological argument there. Let's bypass that. Okay. So here's some specific commands to the man, the Bible, Fathers, what? Provoke not your children to wrath, but we are told to what? Bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. So that's one of the things that we need to do in our leadership role. And then I've already talked about that. It talks about some mutual submission, the head, but that means the voluntary, whatever, the love 3 times, and then we also told to leave your father and mother, and what? Cleave unto your wife, and you should become how many flesh? One flesh. That's the whole idea. I'm going to skip over these. You know those. I'll just mention the bottom. These bottom 2 is what's now being talked about a lot. Transformational leadership and also servant leadership. Greenleaf did a lot of work in that area. You can, mean the leader. And this is biblical because, this is, where Jesus called them, and one wanted to sit on the right hand, one wanted to sit on the left hand. And then, the whole idea is that, really leadership is really about service. Christ said, I came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and give my life a ransom for many. So that's the whole thing, biblical, but that's the term. Hank Allen, again, I'm just trying to show you the resources that the Summit has developed around leadership. His opening chapter, he talks about various kinds of leadership that he thinks is going to be really for the 21st century. And then you can get into the qualifications of biblical leaders. Looking around the room, we don't need to talk about that. But one of the things I do find is that when pastors are called in some churches, that's the last thing that's looked at, in some churches, not all, in terms of what the Bible says. And so we have chapters where we've written there. And then if we had time, again, this is kind of an overview, and I want to at least you're not talking, so I keep talking. Really the Proverbs. Hank did it last night. You can kind of go through them, and you have them in your handouts, so I'm going to let you do it yourself. But you can see how all of those things really focus on leadership. Trust in the Lord with all thy heart. Lean not on your understanding. In all thy ways what? Acknowledge him, and he will direct thy paths. The steps of a good man is what? Ordered by the Lord. We can go on. Wisdom again. The fear of the Lord. And this is one here where no counsel is, the people fail, and in the multitude of counselors there is safety. As men, sometimes we violate, and that's what in the book, talking about the Lone Ranger. So you need to have godly counsel around us to move in that direction. Dealing with anger, you know. One of the things as a leader, I always kind of amuse me is when a person has to get up and say, I'm the pastor of this church. Or, I'm the director of this. I mean, everybody know you're the director. I mean, you know, why you know, that tells me something about that person. And so, you know, sometimes, you know, when people say something to me, rather than have to say that, I knew as a director, as a vice president, you know, they were challenging me on some things, and I just listened because I had the power of the pen. You know, whatever they wanted to do, it couldn't be done unless I signed off anyway. So why argue with the person? But anyway, just let them emote. But anyway, you know, be swift to hear, slow to wrath, and slow to speak. You know, all of those things, biblical. And I tried to apply that. And this is the whole anger. I'm going to go through them quickly. You know, when a man way please the Lord, he makes his enemies to be at peace with them. You're going to say, yeah, come on. Go ahead and identify yourself.
You're talking.
Yeah.
Because we're not saying.
Yeah.
I'm Pastor Washington from Michigan, here in Grand Rapids, and I wrote a book on godly women in the pulpit, and I think that's important.
Okay.
Is to think about godly women, and that's what Paul was talking about in 1 Timothy 2. He said, godly women, if you profess godliness, then this is what you must do. Okay. And so we have to deal with women that's entering into the pulpit that, hold it now, if you're a godly woman, then you want to listen to what God is saying. And so I had a sermon on the Bible is an open diary of a satisfied God. And God talks about what he did from Genesis to what he was doing and what he has done and what he's going to do. Right. So we have to make sure that we teach the word. That's important. And so watch out. As a pastor, watch out teaching women. And I have over 20 women just in Lower Michigan that are in the ministry. I have two sisters. One is an evangelist, one is senior pastor. And so I've had to deal with those women, and I was president of the Afro-American Fellowship of Michigan, 56 churches under my authority. And so I had to deal with all those women, or even across the nation. But stick with the word. The Bible is, again, the open diary of a satisfied God. And God said in Genesis 1, where he said in that 31st verse, he said, it is very good what he had done. And so we want to make sure that we're teaching women, men, children what God has said.
Now give us the full title of your book.
Godly Women in the pulpit.
Okay, godly women. Okay, good. Okay. Let's just, I'm going to go through, our time is running out, so you can kind of go through that and understand how the Proverbs can apply to leadership. That was my attempt. I would encourage you sometime to do the same thing. Maybe go through and then you might come up with different ones in terms of how you will describe it. And I would be curious if somebody wanted to just shout out, who do you see as some model leaders in the Bible? Just maybe shout out the names. Joseph, okay. Paul. Barnabas. Nehemiah. Okay, well, let's take Paul. Just give us a one sentence why you mentioned Paul.
Because he not only led himself, but he developed leaders and sent his leaders out to develop others so that he continued to multiply leadership.
Things which you've learned, teach also to others that they may. Okay, who else mentioned one? Barnabas? You want to come to the mic and tell us quickly why Barnabas?
Barnabas died to himself in order to exalt another leader, which was Paul.
Okay.
So he gave up, any position that he had so that he can support someone he was going to be an even greater leader than himself.
I heard Joseph. Who said Joseph? You want to tell us? And why don't you come on up and tell us what, did you say one, two? Come on, go up, Nehemiah, go up after him. Quickly, just one sentence.
Joseph was persistent, he was holy, and he had a hold of the vision that God had for his life.
You have to come to my mic. The other one is not picking up. Do this one.
Okay, I wanted to say one of the men I think in the Bible is a leader was Moses' father-in-law, because you know, even though Moses was the leader of the people, there was places where his father-in-law actually, you know, counseled him to put him into the right direction of leadership.
Give us an example quickly.
An example was when Moses was, you know, thinking about doing everything and getting frazzled out, and his father-in-law said, wait a minute, you can't do everything. Appoint some captains under you to do these things so that it takes the load off of you.
So Moses, okay. Pastor Richardson, they didn't hear you, so why don't you repeat Paul?
Paul was not only a leader himself, but he multiplied leadership, and it's what I call discipling other leaders to be leaders.
All right. Nehemiah.
Yeah, Nehemiah.
Tell your case for Nehemiah.
He had the uncanny ability to pull people together in a desperate situation in a land that really wasn't his own at the time. They were all being held captive. But the first thing he did, his heart fell into what he was doing, because his land was being destroyed. So he had to pull all of those people together and plus approach a king to get a grant in order to bring all of those people back to help build and fight at the same time to protect what they were doing from Sanballat and his friends.
Yeah, we have Dr. Lau coming up, but I want to flip the switch, and I want, before you come in, I want 2 examples of effective women leaders in the Bible. And then after him, go ahead.
I'll give you one.
And your other point too.
No, that's my point. I was going to say Aquila, because Aquila wasn't threatened by a strong woman, Priscilla.
Okay, all right. So you already were ahead of me. Okay, we need at least one more woman. Go ahead, you can do it. Next one is a woman.
I was thinking about Jesus Christ, because he modeled, he exemplified what a leader should be. He taught others, and then he empowered and released them to carry out a vision that even make it possible for us to be here.
And I'm going to do something, and they're going to get mad with me. I want Shirley and Kelly, or Kelly, one of you can decide, to come and tell us your favorite woman and your favorite man leader in the Bible. Okay, so think about it. I'll give you a minute, and I'm going to come back to that. Let me move on, but I want to hear from the 2 women in the back. Let me do. Okay, your list. Here's some I put up. Moses, Joseph, Nehemiah, Daniel, Samuel, Paul, and, you know, I could keep on going, you know, in terms of that. I'm going to just skip through. Kelly, let me know when you get ready, you start walking up. Okay, those are some other nuggets. We won't have time to go through it in the other book. And then I want to end probably with some of the mistakes men make. Kelly, you ready? Come on up. Shirley, you delegating to her? You can come too if you want to. If you want to after her, fine. If not, we'll move on. She's coming. No, you have to do this one. Your favorite man and your favorite woman.
Okay, so I definitely agree with Paul, because I liked how he just put it all out there and really sacrificed quite a bit and built other leaders along with what he did.
Okay.
And one of the women, I would definitely say Esther, because of the position that she was put in. And there's, you know, times where you feel like you can't sacrifice or give up so much of that, but she was able to think more of her culture, her community, and go up to the king and advocate for her people. So I thought that was pretty good people.
What did she put on the line by doing that?
Her life, you know, and at the time, that's a big step.
Okay. Great.
Right.
Shirley. And then we'll end with some mistakes men make. You have to do this one. No, that was not working.
I think of women in several different kinds of roles. I'm thinking of the women who taught Timothy, for instance. Eunice and Lois. And because out of what the Bible tells women to do, one of the things we're to do is to teach those in the home. And then I think that's so important because at one point when, oh, you didn't tell me, was when Paul was talking to Timothy, he was reminding him that he knew from a babe, from a small child, those things that were sufficient really to salvation. And so here, Eunice and Lois had grounded him in those things. And I think of now what our world looks like and the leaders we want to see. Somebody has to ground those leaders. And so those women are ones that come, women who are leading in the home. And some of the other ladies have already been talked about, so why don't I just leave it? I'm sorry?
Your favorite man. No.
Jesus. And I am so thankful that his approach to women would have been different from a lot of what we would have done, including me, some of the people that he chose, and the people who ended up even in Jesus's line, ladies who, well, I just think the way he dealt with the woman at the well, for instance, knowing what her lifestyle had been like. But the thing that touched me about that, he says, when he was talking to her, say, if you had known who it was that you were talking to, you would have asked him for water, and I would have given it. So just that whole thing of Jesus knew her life, her lifestyle and all that, but was more than ready to meet her need, and he could look beyond those circumstances in which she was trapped and see the heart need. And so for that, I'm thankful.
Thank you. Thank you for that contribution. Yeah, quickly, we're running out of time. We've got 5 minutes. If you want to stay a little longer, you can. But we all know this has already been mentioned. You know, this is not limited to men, but the case of Jethro, you know, where Moses, you know, where he was trying to do everything. And that's the whole issue around delegation, you know, building a good leadership team, people you can trust, and then allow them to do things. And, you know, when I was in leadership, you know, my view was that if we allow people to do things, you let them do well, you're going to look good. So I had good directors. They made me look good. You know, I had good administrative assistants who I could trust. And then I would, you know, reinforce them, publicly acknowledge them. But you can't do it all. That's one of the mistakes, both people. Then you notice the case of King Rehoboam. You know, I often think of this, you know, as the leadership was transitioning, he brought the old men around, and then they gave him advice. And then he said, you know, that's not cool. He got the young men. And then he took the advice of the young men. And then he put all of these penalties and burdens on the people. And I've seen that, and that's something very, very important, really, because one of the things I try to do on campus is and I think we need to do more of that as men, is have what I call cross-generational talks, you know, where we encourage these young leaders, but also they get the wisdom from us. And I'm going to say this. You know, one of the things that, you know, President Obama didn't do, in my opinion, and there's some people who reinforce that, is he did not draw upon some of the seasoned civil rights leaders out there. And some of this is public information. You know, he was the first black president, and when you get into a role like that, you should be able to predict some of the things that would happen. And he did not really pull in some of the senior civil rights leaders and others, and really had a small group conference. I mean, and I say this because, you know, like L. Douglas Wilder in Virginia was the first black governor. He said that publicly. and I won't name some names, but I've talked to some other people privately who really was, in the movement, and they say the same thing. And, but anyway, so the whole idea there is to be able to pull on the wisdom. In the multitude of counselors, there's wisdom, but, the younger people, who you're taking over leadership, when you take it from us, don't throw us under the bus, still talk to us. We can give you some nuggets, and then we need to allow you to go ahead and do your thing. This one is, what Mike talked about. I'm not Mike, Hank last night, he called it the PMS, power, money, and sex. We know the case of David and his downfall. And we can also see Joseph, how he dealt with it. You run, you run. Anyway, he didn't do the Joseph thing. He stayed there. Okay, I could go on. All I was trying to do here is kind of touch on some things. I wish we had more time. You have all of that on your handout. Go ahead, any questions or further comments? We can spend the next moment.
I just want to give you a quick leadership concept. Been in ministry 50 years, and when I started out, this came very strong to me. In our denomination, they send you out as unto the Lord, and you are out there. Nobody checks on you. You don't have to fill out no forms. You don't have to report to nobody. And very early, I decided I needed 3 relationships in my life. I needed a Paul, more than one. I needed Barnabas beside me. I needed some Timothys beside me. And over the years, I found Paul's, the Barnabases, and accountable to all of them. Right. Wisdom, accountability to Barnabas, and coming along. And God blessed me to see some Timothys become some Barnabases.
Right.
And one in particular is now a Paul.
Thank you. Any quick questions? Any burning questions that anyone has? Yes.
Would you talk a little bit more about the part of your presentation that says there's at least some different perception of leadership styles between men and women and what makes them?
Yeah, okay. The question is, what are some of the difference in leadership styles between men and women and the perception of what makes them effective? Shirley, you know any of that offhand? But anyway, the idea is that when you do evaluations, women and men tend to be evaluated differently. And a lot of that they've found from a research standpoint, if you could get a person to fill out a questionnaire on their perception of women in general, as emotional and all of those kinds of things, then those kinds of prior attitudes, which have nothing necessarily to do with how they are performing, is kind of used then in the evaluation process. And so, so that's part of what they're doing. And there's a whole literature now. There was a book, I think it was written in the 70s, that really spurred not only this kind of research, but other kinds of research. It was written by Carol Gilligan, a psychologist. It's called In a Different Voice. And the whole idea is that women often use different kinds of language to describe certain kinds of things. Some males will use, if they'll see that language and they see it as a sign of weakness, et cetera, et cetera. Women tend in general to be more relational, and some men have different issues with that. And so your perception of women in general, and that's why I was asking your question about, you need to think through your own theology on women in ministry, because not my view, is whatever your view there is also going to affect how you see people, and you might have a biased interpretation of them based on that, not based on their particular performance. Am I making sense? So those are some of the things that I would say in that regard. Any other quick questions? And then I would encourage you, if you haven't done that, it's a way of, Stan Gundry is here. He was the general editor of this book. It's a very good book on two views of women in ministry. And what they attempt to do here is to lay out the various perspectives. You know, people speaking this way, others speaking another way, and then they got reactions, and we need to think through what is our own position, theological position there. How's this book doing? Yeah, okay, all right. What motivated it? It was, you got to come here, you got to come, we can't, and then we'll close with that. No, it's not on sale here, but
we publish a whole series of books that we call counterpoints books. And in general, these books take issues of real significance and controversy among Bible-believing Christians, and we choose a representative, a good representative of each of the positions, and we say, okay, in an irenic and biblical way, make your best case for your view. And we may have 2, 3, or 4 different positions. I mean, we've done this with the women in ministry issue. We've done it with things like the doctrine of the atonement, other practical and theological issues. And then each of the participants gives a 2 to 3 page response to the other positions. And so it's a whole series of such books, counterpoints. You just look up counterpoints on Amazon or something like that, and you'll find many of those books listed. And this book is written from the standpoint of 2 individuals who defend what is called the complementarian position on women in leadership, and 2 individuals who defend the egalitarian position on women in church leadership. Okay?
And the goal was, what do you see as the goal of those books?
Well, the goal is to, number one, promote irenic discussion of these important issues. Irenic, peaceful.
Okay, all right. Break that down.
I'm sorry. Okay. Peaceful, polite discussion among Christians on these topics, with the hope that, number one, it will promote respect for one another in spite of our differences, but also equip people to make more informed decisions as to what their own convictions are and why.
Yeah, let me close in prayer briefly. Lord, we thank you for this session together, and we thank you for your word and what's in it, and we just pray that you will continue to work with us as men to do what is right in terms of our leadership, also how we deal with women, because we know that in your prayer, your high priestly prayer, you said you pray that we would all be one, and that you want your body to be unified. We just thank you for all that you do. We thank you again for the summit, the leadership that Matt has provided, and the mantle now being passed to Brother Westbrook. We ask your continued blessing on every man, every person, rather, that's in this session, that you'll continue to help us to grow, and we can be the kind of servant that you would have us to be. In Jesus' name, amen.